We're following breaking news on the tensions between Canada and the United States.
Carney gave a speech to the World Economic Forum in Davos on Tuesday saying the old world order is over and urging middle powers to unite.
$220 billion in annual United States auto output is now being modeled as exposed to competitive displacement, while more than $1.1 trillion in supply chain activity sits directly in the blast radius of a deepening trade war realignment between Canada and the European Union. This is not a headline built on speculation. It is a structural scenario increasingly discussed in policy briefings, investment committees, and manufacturing strategy sessions across North America. At the center of the concern is a strategic alignment between Canada and the European Union that goes beyond diplomacy. Canada is positioning itself as a stable transatlantic manufacturing bridge, and that shift could quietly redraw the industrial map. What most analysts refuse to say openly is this: $220 billion at risk may be only the visible fracture. Beneath it lies a compounding chain reaction that could unleash losses measured in the trillions across the United States economy, jobs, pensions, credit markets, and state finances. Today, I will expose the part no one has fully quantified, the devastating multiplier effect that has never been publicly laid out in full. The most shocking numbers are still ahead. If $220 billion represents direct annual auto output at risk inside the United States, the deeper shock lies in what surrounds it. Because the American auto industry does not operate in isolation. When economists combine direct manufacturing, suppliers, logistics, financing, retail distribution, and induced consumer activity, the broader ecosystem connected to automotive production exceeds $1.1 trillion in total annual economic activity. And that is where the real danger begins. The modern United States vehicle is assembled from thousands of components that cross state lines and national borders multiple times before final delivery. A single mid-sized assembly plant can depend on more than 2,500 Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers. If even 12% of future electric vehicle platform allocation shifts toward Canada-aligned facilities over the next 5 years, multiple United States plants could fall below the 75% capacity utilization threshold that industry analysts describe as the profitability survival line. Below that line, fixed costs do not shrink, they intensify. A 10% sustained decline in assembly utilization across key manufacturing states could translate into production value losses exceeding $80 billion annually. When multiplied across suppliers, steel, aluminum, plastics, semiconductors, battery modules, the contraction spreads quickly. For every 100 direct manufacturing jobs lost in auto production, nearly 300 additional jobs across transportation, warehousing, local retail, and services become exposed. The employment math grows severe. The United States auto sector directly employs roughly 950,000 workers. When suppliers and downstream services are included, more than 4 million jobs are connected to this ecosystem. A 12% structural contraction over 5 years could place more than 120,000 direct manufacturing jobs at risk. When supplier networks contract in response, total exposure could approach 300,000 to 400,000 positions nationwide. And this is before financial contagion begins. Auto loans in the United States exceed $1.6 trillion in outstanding balances. If job losses rise in manufacturing corridors, even a 2% increase in delinquency rates could expose more than $30 billion in stressed credit. Regional banks concentrated in Midwest states would feel that pressure first. Meanwhile, corporate borrowing costs would not remain untouched. A 150 basis point increase in bond spreads for major automakers carrying tens of billions in outstanding debt could redirect billions of dollars annually away from research, electrification, and plant modernization. That lost investment compounds future weakness. Energy pricing deepens the divide. In provinces such as Quebec, where hydroelectric power dominates, industrial electricity pricing remains structurally stable. In energy-intensive battery manufacturing, electricity can represent up to 30% of operating cost. A sustained 15% cost differential over a decade influences site selection decisions worth billions of dollars. Then there is export exposure. If retaliatory measures within the trade war environment impose even modest cost penalties on United States vehicles entering European markets, competitive margins narrow sharply. In segments where profit per vehicle can already be thin, a compliance or tariff-related cost increase of several $1,000s per unit can determine whether a platform survives or is discontinued. What begins as $220 billion in annual output exposure becomes a systemic vulnerability. Production shifts reduce supplier orders, supplier reductions trigger layoffs. Layoffs weaken housing markets in manufacturing counties. Housing declines pressure municipal tax bases, pension contributions shrink, state borrowing costs rise, consumer confidence softens, equity valuations adjust downward. This is how $220 billion evolves into a $1 trillion domino. And yet even this may understate the severity of the structural shift underway between Canada and the European Union within the broader trade war landscape. Because the next layer of exposure is not confined to factories or loans. It reaches into pensions, municipal bonds, and long-term fiscal stability inside the United States. If Part 2 exposed a $1 trillion ecosystem vulnerability, the next layer pushes the scenario into territory few policymakers are prepared to confront publicly. Because when industrial contraction intersects with credit markets, pensions, housing, and state finance, the cumulative exposure can accelerate beyond $2 trillion over a 10-year horizon. This is where the trade war stops being about tariffs and starts becoming about systemic risk inside the United States. Begin with credit markets. The United States automotive sector is deeply intertwined with more than $1 trillion, $600 billion in outstanding auto loans, in addition to hundreds of billions in corporate bonds issued by manufacturers, suppliers, and finance subsidiaries. If sustained production contraction leads to 150,000 direct job losses over 5 to 7 years, delinquency rates in manufacturing-heavy regions could rise materially. Even a 2.5% national increase in auto loan stress would place roughly $40 billion into elevated risk categories. That shock would not be evenly distributed. Midwest regional banks, credit unions, and community lenders heavily concentrated in auto-dependent counties would feel disproportionate strain. Loan loss provisions rise, lending standards tighten, consumer credit availability contracts. Reduced credit availability suppresses vehicle demand further, reinforcing the contraction loop. Next comes corporate leverage. Major United States automakers carry tens of billions of dollars in long-term debt. If investor confidence weakens due to export erosion linked to Canada and European Union alignment, bond spreads can widen rapidly. A 200 basis point rise in average borrowing costs on $100 billion of sector-wide corporate debt equates to $2 billion in additional annual interest expense. That capital does not disappear quietly. It is diverted away from electrification research, artificial intelligence integration, autonomous driving systems, and next-generation battery chemistry. Delayed innovation becomes lost competitiveness. Then pensions enter the equation. States such as Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee maintain public pension systems intertwined with auto sector employment and supplier networks. A sustained 10% contraction in payroll tax contributions over multiple fiscal cycles widens funding gaps. Pension funding shortfalls force difficult decisions. Increase taxes, reduce benefits, or issue additional municipal debt. Each option weakens consumer confidence and compresses local spending. Municipal bonds are particularly sensitive. If even 2 auto-dependent states experience credit rating pressure due to shrinking tax bases and rising pension obligations, borrowing costs for infrastructure projects increase. Higher municipal yields cascade into delayed highway upgrades, port modernization, and grid improvements. Infrastructure stagnation undermines future industrial competitiveness, creating a negative feedback cycle that compounds over years. Housing markets amplify the damage. Manufacturing wages anchor entire county-level housing ecosystems. In regions where auto payroll represents a primary income source, a 15% employment decline could translate into home value contractions between 8 and 20%. Across multiple industrial states, tens of billions of dollars in household wealth could erode. Lower household wealth suppresses consumer spending, which accounts for roughly 70% of United States economic output. A half percentage point drag on annual national growth may not sound dramatic. In a $27 trillion economy, that translates into roughly $135 billion in lost economic expansion per year. Over a decade, cumulative foregone growth approaches $1,350 billion. Layer this with export decline. If the Canada and European Union industrial alignment captures even 15% of North American new electric vehicle platform allocation by 2032, United States annual vehicle output could decline by 1.5 to 2 million units relative to baseline projections. At an average transaction value exceeding $45,000 per vehicle, that represents roughly $70 billion to $90 billion in annual production displacement. Over 10 years, cumulative output loss alone could approach $900 billion. Add capital diversion. If Canada secures $150 billion to $250 billion in incremental battery mineral processing and electric vehicle assembly investment over the next decade through regulatory alignment and carbon certification advantages, that capital is not circulating inside the United States. It builds research hubs, supplier clusters, and high-wage engineering ecosystems elsewhere. Once those ecosystems mature, reversing the shift becomes extraordinarily expensive. The compounding effect pushes total structural exposure beyond $2 trillion between 2026 and 2036 under a high-severity modeling scenario. And unlike a sudden financial crisis, this transformation would unfold gradually, quarter by quarter, earnings report by earnings report, plant expansion by plant expansion cancellation. By the time the shift becomes obvious in national statistics, the capital will already be committed, the supply chains rewired, the engineering talent relocated, and the competitive gap entrenched. The central question is no longer whether the United States can build vehicles. It is whether policy volatility within an extended trade war environment unintentionally accelerates an industrial migration toward Canada and its European Union partners. The numbers most Americans have seen so far represent only the surface layer. The full 10-year projection, when credit stress, pension gaps, housing corrections, capital flight, and export erosion are modeled together, suggests a magnitude of structural disruption not publicly acknowledged in mainstream debate. And the most destabilizing variable of all has not yet been addressed. What happens if global capital markets begin pricing the United States auto sector as structurally declining rather than cyclically challenged? That shift in perception alone could trigger consequences far beyond manufacturing. If the previous projections approach $2 trillion in cumulative exposure, the final layer forces a more uncomfortable question. What if this is not a temporary competitive cycle, but a permanent shift in industrial gravity away from the United States? Because when production declines intersect with sovereign debt dynamics, capital allocation trends, and long-term geopolitical alignment, the impact extends far beyond factories and payrolls. Consider federal fiscal pressure. The United States national debt already exceeds $34 trillion. Annual interest payments have climbed into the hundreds of billions. If industrial tax bases weaken across major manufacturing states due to sustained auto sector contraction, federal revenue growth slows. Even a modest structural drag of 1 percentage point on annual gross domestic product growth reduces federal revenue by roughly $200 billion per year relative to baseline projections. Over 10 years, that gap approaches $2 trillion in lost fiscal capacity. At the same time, displaced workers require unemployment support, retraining programs, healthcare subsidies, and regional revitalization funding. Federal outlays rise precisely as revenue growth decelerates. Bond markets respond to widening deficits. If long-term Treasury yields rise by even 50 basis points due to sustained fiscal deterioration, annual interest expenses increase by tens of billions of dollars. Industrial contraction becomes fiscal acceleration. Now widen the lens further. Automotive manufacturing anchors demand for steel, aluminum, petrochemicals, semiconductors, robotics, and industrial machinery. If annual United States vehicle output declines by 2 million units relative to baseline over a prolonged horizon, downstream industrial demand weakens across multiple sectors simultaneously, steel orders shrink, aluminum smelters operate below capacity, rail freight volumes decline, port throughput contracts, insurance premiums tied to industrial shipping adjust downward, signaling reduced economic momentum. Capital markets price this shift quickly. If major United States automakers experience sustained margin compression and equity valuations fall by 30% over multiple cycles, pension funds and retirement portfolios nationwide absorb losses. Millions of American households hold exposure to industrial equities through retirement accounts. A $50 billion to $100 billion market capitalization erosion is not abstract. It reduces retirement security. Then there is global perception. If multinational corporations increasingly view Canada as the stable regulatory bridge to European Union markets, capital allocation committees begin prioritizing facilities north of the border. Once 10 or 15 flagship electric vehicle and battery plants cluster in Ontario and Quebec under harmonized sustainability frameworks, supply chains reorient permanently. Research hubs follow production. Engineering talent relocates toward growth ecosystems. Brain migration compounds quietly. Even a 5% annual shift in advanced battery and automotive software research spending toward Canada over a decade could relocate tens of thousands of high-wage innovation roles. Intellectual property accumulates where research density concentrates. The United States risks ceding not only production share, but technological leadership. And here lies the most destabilizing projection. If cumulative lost output, capital diversion, export erosion, housing corrections, credit stress, pension shortfalls, and fiscal drag are modeled together under a sustained high-severity scenario, total structural economic distortion could exceed $2.3 trillion between 2026 and 2036. That figure rivals the scale of past financial crises. Yet this would not arrive as a sudden collapse. It would emerge gradually, investment decision by investment decision, as Canada deepens alignment with the European Union, while the United States remains locked in an extended trade war. Posture marked by tariff volatility and retaliatory friction. Industrial gravity does not shift overnight, but once it shifts, it rarely returns. If North American electric vehicle leadership consolidates under a Canada-European Union axis, supported by clean energy advantages, carbon compliance, compatibility, and policy predictability, the United States auto sector could find itself operating from a structurally weakened position for an entire generation. The risk is not merely economic. It is strategic. Automotive manufacturing underpins defense supply chains, advanced materials research, artificial intelligence integration, and energy transition infrastructure. A diminished auto ecosystem weakens national industrial resilience, and the most unsettling reality is this. By the time quarterly data confirms the shift, the factories will already be built elsewhere, the supply contracts signed, the talent embedded, and the competitive edge transferred. What began as $220 billion at risk may ultimately be remembered as the opening chapter of a multi-trillion-dollar industrial realignment. The defining question now facing policymakers, investors, and voters inside the United States is whether the current trajectory within this prolonged trade war represents strategic strength or the quiet beginning of long-term industrial decline. If the previous projection approached $2.3 trillion in structural distortion, the final escalation forces an even harsher scenario. What happens if global capital markets, sovereign debt investors, And multinational manufacturers begin treating the United States auto sector not as cyclically pressured, but as structurally impaired. Because once that classification shifts, the consequences accelerate beyond industrial modeling. They enter systemic repricing. Begin with sovereign risk sensitivity. The United States depends on steady economic expansion to sustain its fiscal structure. If prolonged trade war friction, retaliatory barriers, and regulatory divergence contribute to a sustained reduction of 1 full percentage point in long-term annual growth, cumulative lost output over 10 years would exceed $2.7 trillion in a $27 trillion economy. That gap compounds federal debt ratios. If weaker growth collides with rising industrial unemployment and expanded fiscal stabilization spending, annual deficits widen structurally. Should long-term Treasury yields rise by 75 basis points as markets price slower productivity growth, annual interest servicing costs could climb by more than $100 billion. Over a decade, additional interest burdens alone could approach $1 trillion. Industrial erosion becomes fiscal gravity. Now extend the industrial chain reaction further. If United States vehicle production contracts by 2 million units annually relative to baseline for 5 consecutive years, cumulative output displacement would approach $400 billion before secondary effects are included when supplier contraction, logistics compression, and downstream service reductions are layered in. That 5-year disruption could exceed $700 billion. Stretch that trend to 10 years, and the cumulative industrial displacement surpasses $1.3 trillion. And that is before housing, pensions, and financial markets are fully integrated into the model. In manufacturing, heavy counties where auto payroll anchors local consumption, a sustained employment decline of 15 to 20% could trigger housing value corrections exceeding 20%. Across multiple states, residential wealth exposure could surpass $150 billion. Housing contractions weaken property tax receipts, school funding, and municipal bond stability. Credit contagion intensifies. With more than $1.6 trillion in outstanding auto loans nationwide, even a 3% systemic delinquency increase tied to industrial job losses would stress nearly $50 billion in consumer credit. Banks tighten lending standards. Auto financing rates rise. Vehicle demand weakens further, reinforcing contraction. Equity markets do not remain insulated. If major United States automakers and top-tier suppliers experience sustained earnings downgrades due to export erosion toward Canada-aligned production networks, total sector market capitalization losses could exceed $150 billion across cycles. Retirement funds and pension portfolios absorb the impact. Reduced household wealth suppresses discretionary spending nationally. The spiral becomes self-reinforcing. At the same time, Canada continues absorbing strategic capital. If Canadian provinces secure more than $250 billion in cumulative battery, mineral processing, electric vehicle assembly, and software-defined vehicle investment under harmonized European Union sustainability frameworks by 2035, that ecosystem consolidates permanently, supply chains densify, talent clusters mature, research institutions align with production hubs. Innovation gravity shifts. Once 10 to 15 gigafactories operate under integrated Canada-European Union carbon certification regimes, procurement committees recalibrate long-term sourcing strategies, contracts signed for 20-year supply commitments are rarely reversed. The cost of rebuilding displaced ecosystems inside the United States could exceed several $100 billion, and even then, without guaranteed reversion. Now, aggregate the layers, lost output potential exceeding $1.3 trillion, reduced gross domestic product growth approaching $2.7 trillion, additional federal interest burdens near $1 trillion. Housing wealth exposure surpassing $150 billion. Credit stress exceeding $50 billion. capital flight and redirected investment beyond $250 billion. Under a sustained high-severity projection, total macroeconomic distortion tied directly or indirectly to prolonged trade war. Industrial divergence could exceed $3 trillion between 2026 and 2036. That magnitude rivals the scale of historic financial crises. Yet this would not unfold in weeks. It would materialize in silence, earnings call by earnings call, factory allocation by factory allocation, policy decision by policy decision. The most dangerous moment in structural decline is not collapse. It is normalization. If markets begin accepting diminished United States auto centrality as the new baseline, while Canada solidifies itself as the transatlantic industrial hinge to the European Union, the competitive map of North America may be permanently redrawn. Industrial leadership, once lost, is rarely reclaimed without generational cost. The question confronting the United States is no longer whether it can compete. It is whether sustained policy volatility within an extended trade war environment inadvertently accelerates a realignment so profound that recovery becomes economically prohibitive. What began as $220 billion at risk may ultimately mark the opening phase of a multi-trillion-dollar industrial transition, one that reshapes employment, fiscal stability, capital markets, and technological leadership for decades. The final piece of this analysis will confront the strategic choice facing policymakers in Washington and whether reversal is still possible before the tipping point becomes irreversible. After projections approaching $3 trillion in cumulative structural exposure, the central issue is no longer theoretical modeling, it is strategic choice. The United States remains one of the most advanced industrial economies in the world. It retains deep capital markets, world-class engineering talent, advanced semiconductor capabilities, and enormous domestic consumer demand. The question is not capacity. The question is direction. In a prolonged trade war environment, tariffs can deliver short-term leverage, but long-term industrial strength depends on predictability, regulatory coordination, and supply chain integration. If Canada continues aligning its industrial standards with the European Union while emphasizing carbon certification compatibility, mineral security, and stable policy frameworks, global capital will continue to evaluate North American site selection through that lens. Capital seeks stability. Manufacturers allocating $20 billion electric vehicle platforms do not prioritize headlines. They prioritize 20-year certainty. If the United States is perceived as volatile, while Canada is perceived as aligned and predictable, the gravitational pull intensifies. However, the outcome is not predetermined. The United States could respond by reinforcing continental coordination rather than fragmenting it, harmonizing carbon accounting frameworks, stabilizing tariff policy, accelerating domestic grid modernization, and expanding mineral processing capacity within its own borders would directly counterbalance the advantage Canada is building. In other words, the solution is not escalation alone. It is structural competitiveness. The automotive sector anchors steel, aluminum, robotics, artificial intelligence, logistics, and defense manufacturing. Protecting that ecosystem requires more than protective duties. It requires synchronized industrial policy aligned with global standards. If Washington recalibrates towards stability and long-term coordination, the projected multi-trillion-dollar exposure becomes a warning, not a destiny. If volatility persists, the compounding effects described across production, employment, credit markets, housing, pensions, and fiscal capacity may gradually solidify into structural decline. Industrial gravity does not shift overnight. But once enough capital commits elsewhere, reversal becomes exponentially expensive. The defining question now facing the United States is direct and unavoidable. Is the current trajectory within this extended trade war a bold strategy that ultimately strengthens domestic industry, or a risky miscalculation that accelerates capital flight and long-term industrial repositioning toward Canada and its European Union partners? The numbers are large, the timeline is long, the consequences are generational. Thanks for watching.